This podcast contains our own personal views not associated with any organisation. Coronial contains descriptions of death inquests that may be graphic and disturbing to some listeners. Discretion is advised.
Hi everyone and welcome back to Coronial. My name is Emma.
I'm Alice.
I'm Georgie.
So in today's episode, we'll be taking a look at the coroner's findings regarding the death of Christian Adrian Root, known as Adrian, which occurred on the 18th of October in 2018. Adrian was 17 years old and he lived in Yass, New South Wales with his family.
Yes!
So Adrian was in year 10 at Campbell High School in Canberra in the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory, where he had been attending school since year 7. Adrian was described by his peers as an enthusiastic boxer and a capable sportsman. He and his family moved to Australia in 2009 from South Africa.
And when they say, what is it, experienced boxer?
It was a enthusiastic boxer.
I'm assuming that means in the sports sense rather than the
fighting sense.
Yeah.
In the sports sense,
yeah,
yes. Yeah. And he was also a capable sportsman. So, he was all into his sports. So on the morning of the 18th of October 2018, at about 7:20 a.m, Adrian departed his residence and attended Campbell High School. At about 10 a.m, Adrian went to the school gymnasium for physical education, PE class, which was scheduled in the second period for about 1 hour. A decision was made for 5 classes of year 9 and 10 students to play Capture the Flag at the base of Mount Ainslie for the PE lesson.
Oh.
Have you read this one?
Oh, I know why I know this now. This was on my list of, considering to do. Okay. So you beat me to it. How dare you? But I was like, I feel like we've covered one in Yass before. Why do I? And now I'm like, it's because I've read this one several times, being like, should I do that? It's not what you think is going to happen.
Yeah, it's
okay.
It's nothing to do with boxing, if that's where you thought it was going.
And even then, it's really nothing to do with Capture the Flag either.
Huh. Okay, I'm interested.
But it does occur while they're playing Capture the Flag, yes.
At the base of Mount Ainslie is Remembrance Memorial Park, which is a dense bushland area accessible to the public. The park is a 12-minute walk from Campbell High School and was regularly used by the school as a learning and resource space. 5 classes totaling about 112 students from year 9 and 10 were supervised by 5 teachers, referred to in the coroner's report as educators 1 through 5.
I feel like that's not enough teachers for 100 children outside of the school environment.
So it's each teacher for
that
each class.
Yeah, I suppose that makes sense.
But nothing additional.
But on a side note, this sounds like an incredible activity. They're like, if
I know,
I'm
it
in
sounds
high
like
school,
so much fun.
if,
get to leave school.
Those 100 people, did they all just happen to have PE at once, or did other people get to skip their maths and English?
All just had PE at once.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So the coroner went into detail about describing Capture the Flag, so I'll provide an overview of the game for those who are unaware, as it does provide some context to the incident and issues discussed.
And I've also not played it for a very long time.
Yeah, I don't know.
Please refresh me on the rules.
So players are divided into 2 teams, and the game is generally played outside in an area with 2 halves, with each team occupying a half. Each team has a base within their territory which contains flags. The aim of the game is to run into your opposing team's territory, grab a flag, and return it to your base without being tagged by the opposing team's players. If a player is tagged by the opposing team while in the opposing team's territory, that player must sit in the opposing team's jail and wait to be rescued. The team that gets the opposing team's flags into its own base wins.
And you can rescue them by being able to get there.
Yeah, and grabbing them without being tagged again. And
that's just bringing back memories. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So Capture the Flag was described as part of Campbell High School culture and was played on at least a monthly basis. A minimum of 2 classes was required to play the game, with up to 6 classes playing at times. So a big game.
I do like this culture. I'm like, this seems so fun.
The game was most often played off the school grounds at Mount Ainslie, although it was sometimes played on the school oval. When it was played at Mount Ainslie, the game was played on an established area which had been used for many years. The field was approximately 400 by 150 metres in size, and natural borders were used to delineate the zone, so walking tracks and fire trails to mark the boundaries.
And this was a cleared area in that there were no trees?
No, so the natural environment of the park meant that there were trees and rocks within the field of play, which were used strategically by the players to hide from opponents.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it sounds like an amazing location to have played it because, there was natural landscape and stuff that you could utilise. So, like, where you set up your base and stuff like that could...
It could be like
on
quite
how the
tactical
landscape
and strategic from the players. So at about 10:45 a.m. towards the end of the game, Adrian was in the jail area, which was near the main walking trail. He was in jail with students TC and SC. Around that time, they noticed a dead tree on the ground nearby. The log was either inside or very close to the playing boundaries of the game. The log was 6.03 metres long and 189 kilos. Between the three boys, they decided to individually try and pick up the log on one side to see who could lift it.
Of course they did.
After everyone
That is such a teenage boy thing to do.
Yes. Like, why? And the thing is, in the inquest, they were all like, we don't really know why we were doing it.
Well, they were
just
bored.
didn't.
They were sitting in jail when everyone else was running around playing capture the flag.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Correct. So after everyone had a turn, 3 more boys arrived at the jail area. Each child had multiple tries of lifting the log. Then they tried to see how high they could lift the log together, so whether they could lift it up to their shoulders or lift it up above their heads. And then they decided that they would try and lift the log and flip it.
This is a great idea.
At some point, 5 of the boys, including Adrian, stood at one end of the log and began to lift it up, extending their hands above their heads. As they pushed the log up at an angle greater than 45 degrees to the ground, the log began to slip. 2 of the boys moved to the left of the log, the other 2 to the right. Adrian did not move from his position under the log, and it fell and struck him on the left side of his head above his ear, which knocked him unconscious. Adrian had blood coming from his ears, nose and mouth, and he was not moving or making any noise.
Wow, that's traumatic.
Yeah.
For all these school kids
Yeah.
and teachers.
Oh.
After appreciating the seriousness of the incident, SC asked another student to call an ambulance. That student put the phone on loudspeaker and then gave the phone to Educator 1 when the teachers began arriving at the scene. From the 000 call, contact was first made at 10:50 a.m. and the teachers were likely to have been at Adrian's side within 90 seconds of that call being made. TC said he ran to the teachers to seek help from educators 1, 3 and 4, who were about 15 to 50 metres away at the time. Educator 3 told police that he could not see Adrian from that distance because Adrian was up a small hill and behind bushes. Educators 1 and 3 lifted the log of Adrian. They said the log was so heavy that it required both of them to lift it, and these were 2 male.
Wow, okay, hang on.
Adults.
So it came down on him and was still,
It
on
was
him.
still on him.
I assumed it hit him, but then wasn't actually, like, physically on him.
Yeah, like bounced off him.
No,
Okay, wow.
yeah, still on him. Not obviously sure where, but since it struck him on the head. So it was unclear to both those educators whether or not Adrian was breathing at that point in time.
Okay.
At the time, BC, who was a registered nurse, was walking along the walking trail. She observed Adrian lying on his left side with a large amount of blood coming from his head. So whether this was before or after the log was lifted.
On a side note, just like
after.
convenient, a registered nurse just walking
know,
on this
yeah.
trail. Like, what?
Yeah. BC stopped to provide assistance. She checked his pulse, which she described as a good radial pulse, but she later observed Adrian's skin begin to change colour and realised that he was no longer breathing.
Oh.
Chest compressions were commenced by Educator 3 while BC assisted removing blood from Adrian's mouth to keep his airway clear. In the meantime, some of the boys who were involved ran down the road to meet the emergency services. Educators 2 and 5 began collecting the remaining students and returning them to the school.
Yeah, you don't want them like
No,
crowded
they
around.
need to get cleared
Absolutely.
out as soon as possible. After 15 minutes of paramedics arriving with continuous chest compressions and a shot of adrenaline, Adrian's circulation returned. He was transferred to the ambulance where his heart stopped again on the journey to the hospital, but he was again revived. On arrival at the hospital, Adrian was transported for a CT scan with ongoing resuscitation. The scan showed severe brain and skull injuries, a severe spinal cord injury, and a fractured mandible. Doctors formed the opinion that there was no appropriate surgical intervention and that the injuries were not survivable. So Adrian's family made the decision to provide pain relief and cease life support. Adrian passed away at 2:56 p.m. that day. He never regained consciousness at any point following the incident.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so sad.
So there are a number of issues considered by the coroner, which we'll address in order, or we'll look at in order. So first of all, the coroner looked at how to characterise the game of capture the flag that was played that day. So was it an excursion or did it take place on the school grounds? Was it a sporting activity, a recreational activity, an outdoor education activity, a minor game, or all of the above? All of this was important to determine which of the ACT Education Directorate policies and procedures were in place at the time.
Right. Because, like, if you're going for an excursion, you need parental consent.
Mm-hmm. And there's different
there's
sort of risk management procedures and ratios and things like
But
that.
you also
Adults to children.
said that this was very much an established culture at that school. So
Yes.
presumably all parents essentially had
about
given implied consent because they all knew that their kids were going there as part of the activity of the school.
Mhm.
And they'd been going to the same location for many
For
years.
years.
It's not like
Yeah.
it
And it was
was
a
new
cultural
location to
activity
be.
in terms of their school.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So I think
Yeah.
when you're looking at then what policies to address, but in terms of like it being an excursion and the like need for consent, I'm like, it's kind of implied when you're sending your kid there anyway, if you know that it's an activity already.
And it wouldn't have been the first time he had done that activity.
Yeah.
No,
Because he was
absolutely
in,
not.
grade 10?
grade 10 and he'd been
Yeah.
there since year 7.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
No, that's all good. The coroner then looked at whether the relevant policies were then followed and whether they were appropriate. So, yeah, this inquest is very heavy on policy. The coroner then looked at whether there was appropriate supervision of the game that day, whether the teachers had received appropriate training and guidance, and finally, the coroner addressed any potential recommendations in relation to matters of public safety. So first of all, looking at how to characterise capture the flag. So WorkSafe ACT investigated the incident, and during that investigation, there were differing opinions held by Campbell High School students on how to characterise capture the flag. This was the case even after reading all the relevant policies and procedures. So Educator 4 described it as a fitness activity that was a normal classroom activity played by students at the school. Educator 1 agreed that it was a normal classroom activity, but acknowledged it could also fit under the excursion classification. Other educators said that it was part of the school's PE curriculum and is classified as a physical education activity. So basically, the educators there was no consensus on what type of activity this was.
And that kind of makes sense because if it's been
It's all
happening
of the
for
above.
many years, it wouldn't necessarily be written
No,
into the curriculum sort of thing. Like,
And it
it's
also
just
sounded
like it's an
somewhat
activity.
impromptu, that it was like, oh, if all the classes
this
line
particular
up,
day.
Yeah.
how do you fit that into curriculum?
Yeah, you don't.
Yeah.
So the ACT Education Directorate, which is a state government body that oversees policies affecting ACT public schools, stated that capture the flag was a minor game and that the lower slopes of Mount Ainslie were part of the Campbell High School site.
Interesting. When it's actually a public
Is it actually a public place? It is Campbell High School's standard practice that at the start of each school year, an excursion approval letter is requested from each parent. So the terms state that the parent consent to their child attending supervised school activities approved by the principal. The consent covers all occasions during the time that the child is enrolled at the school unless otherwise indicated, but only covers excursions which occur in the immediate vicinity of the school, with specific consent being sought for all other occasions. So there's an overarching consent.
Yeah.
And the last consent on record for Adrian was dated 18 December 2016. So this occurred in 2018, like almost 2 years later, but it did say standard high school practice at the start of each year, but it's an overarching consent. So it's not necessarily a timed consent that only lasts 12 months. So technically, Adrian's parents knew that this happened and they'd given consent previously.
And is there a reason they didn't use the oval for the capture
They
the
did.
flag?
It said they did occasionally.
Yeah, they did
okay.
occasionally, but I think Mount Ainslie was just more fun.
Fair.
More enticing.
Yeah, more enticing. It was, the natural landscape. They could strategize more. And remember, these are 15, 16, 17-year-old kids.
Yeah.
They're not, you know.
Yeah,
and maybe on a
6.
day where like they're getting real ratty in the afternoon, you're like, let's just go run around in the bushland and let you out.
Exactly. The coroner noted that despite the existence of these permission slips, leaving the school grounds always constitutes an excursion and therefore falls under the excursion procedures. So according to the coroner, this particular activity would have been classified as a Category A excursion with movement generally on foot in the vicinity of the school. So
Sure.
the coroner disagreed that Mount Ainslie was part of the school.
Yeah.
Okay,
And
yeah.
I just thinking
That makes
about
sense, yeah.
it being part of the school grounds. It's not.
It's not. It's a public park.
Absolutely not part of the school grounds.
No, and they had to walk 12
Yeah.
minutes to get there. And this is a public park. It's Remembrance Memorial Park that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the coroner found that the game was a physical education activity that was not conducted on the school site and therefore was an excursion. The coroner did note that multiple classifications could be given to the type of activity. It could be a sporting activity, a fitness activity, an outdoor activity, a minor game, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
So it didn't actually make a finding on what exact type of activity it was. So what was the relevant guidance and was it complied with? Because of the type of activity, there were a number of procedures that would have been relevant on this occasion. The coroner helpfully pulled together some of the relevant provisions from the procedures and we'll go through them, and as you'll see, there were some contradictions between the policies in relation to the requirement for a risk assessment for this type of activity. So one policy said that as a physical activity, there was a general requirement that the school principal would develop a risk assessment and management plan. Another policy said that as a Category A excursion, the completion of a risk assessment pro forma was recommended but not mandatory. Another said that for a physical education activity conducted off-site, a risk assessment and management plan was required and informed consent and current medical information was required from each student's parents.
Well, that seems like a lot of effort.
And then another policy said if a minor game was being conducted in the school's immediate environment, a risk assessment was not required, but the activity must have been approved by the principal. So there's basically several different policies in place that this could fall under, and they're all saying different things.
Yeah. And like, can you just say, well, I want it to fit under this one that requires the least amount of energy for me?
Yeah, but then you're not then contradicting the other policies.
Yeah, true. And I'm assuming if this is something that had been historically done, that no risk assessment would have been completed.
Or if there was, it would have been from years ago.
Yeah, yeah.
So an investigator from WorkSafe ACT actually asked one of the educators to determine where Capture the Flag at Mount Ainslie would fall under all of these policies.
But just picked one of them because we already know that none of them could agree anyway.
No, the educator replied, I would need to be given substantial time off work to make that happen because it's not an easy task.
Oh, nice. I like this educator.
It's like, I don't know. You tell me, basically.
Yeah.
Like, I can't work it out.
Yeah.
And even if you have a risk assessment for the game of Capture the Flag, that's not going to cover some teenage boys picking up a really heavy log.
True.
Like, the risk of Capture the Flag is someone knocking someone else over, you tripping, or, you know, all those sorts of
it being an environment that's not just a flat oval.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's completely right. So the coroner noted that the policy issue was a total grey area, but ultimately found that as it was a physical activity off-site, then, technically there should have been a risk assessment in place. And there was also not approval in place from the school principal or the director. So there was nothing sort of formal. Right.
But again, we assume the principal did approve this activity because
at some point
they would have known
been 10
about
years ago.
Yeah, but like even a subsequent principal coming along again implied approval because they've not stopped the activity. That's a big culture at the school that they definitely know is happening. That's somewhat implied that approval is there, even if it's not formally documented.
So, as you just said, Alice, there was some discussion of whether a risk assessment would have foreseen or addressed the circumstances of Adrian's death. Most educators agreed, while the specific instance of a very heavy tree branch being lifted may not have been foreseen, it was reasonable to predict that teenagers may engage in mischief and misbehaviour, particularly when left bored and unattended or in small groups. So there was, there's some, not that exact circumstance,
but they may get
one that
up
would
to
cause
something.
death is still quite low in my mind of likelihood.
I don't necessarily think so.
Do you think teenage boys can get
If you're
up to more?
challenging each other to like a running race and then you trip and hit your head, like there's a bunch of things that you could do. You know, it's that thing where you're a kid and you're bored.
But you're just not aware of the potential consequences of your actions at those ages.
You are not thinking
These kids are a little bit older.
But even still, they're only, 14?
No, 17. But, yeah, kids just do things without knowing or having any regard to.
We've covered enough cases now that we know that kids just don't have that same regard for safety.
And even teenagers and even people in their early 20s.
Their brains are not developed.
They're not developed. And you just do silly things and you're like, why?
And I think in that group circumstance as well.
Yes.
In a
very much
group,
so. Like, it would have been like,
increase that risk.
Oh, I could lift this.
Do you bet that I could lift that log? Yeah, I don't reckon you could do it. And then,
it escalates.
Do we not already do that, like, even as peers now, even in our 30s?
Yeah, but they're less risky activities.
Yeah, not to that extent. I'm not going to go tell you to lift a log.
Yeah, true.
And the reality is that for Adrian and his 4 other mates that were lifting this log at the time, it could have been any one of them.
Oh, yeah. It could have been none of them.
It could have been none of them. It could have been 2 of them.
It could have been all of them.
Yeah. So the coroner referred to a Campbell High School risk assessment that was done for the 2017 cross-country carnival, which was held at the base of Mount Ainslie. A number of risks were identified in that assessment, including unacceptable student behaviour. The likelihood of this occurring was assessed as possible, and the consequence listed as moderate. The stated control measure to address the risk was to brief the students on expectations prior to the departure to the cross-country carnival. So on the day of the incident, Educator 1 had conducted a verbal safety briefing to the students, as was standard practice. So the briefing included the rules of the game, how to play, safety rules, which included no fast running, no picking up anything off the ground.
Such as a massive tree.
Leaving the environment as it is, and also notifying the teachers if there was any wildlife that they sighted, like a snake or whatever.
Oh, yeah. To be honest, that's what I thought was going to happen when you started mentioning the log. I was like, there's going to be a snake.
Yeah.
Nope. But basically, he had done what he could to discourage people from doing things that could result in harm.
And it's so hard, I find, from an adult perspective sometimes as well, because we think like, no, of course we're not going to go up and lift a heavy log. Like, that's such a silly thing to do. Why would you do that? So from an adult perspective or an educator's perspective, they'd be like, of course that's not going to happen, because why would you do that?
Yeah.
And then it happens.
Yeah.
Even with little kids, it's like you watch them do silly things and you're like, you just don't understand their thought process because, again, they just don't understand the consequences of their actions. And so it seems like a good idea at the time.
Yeah.
Let's give it a go. The whole risk-taking.
It's learning. It's a learning
thing for sure, but sometimes you just like, as an adult, because you've had that experience or you understand the consequences, you're sort of like, of course no kid is going to go and try and lift a 180-kilo log off the ground.
Yeah.
So ultimately, the coroner found that the risk of injuries to students from the natural environment at Mount Ainslie while playing Capture the Flag was unknown to staff, as they had not been provided with a risk assessment, which I don't particularly agree with.
Yeah. I mean, you can't... That's like saying if I walked down a very steep slope because no one had told me that there was a risk I'd fall over, that I therefore didn't know the risk.
Yeah.
I don't agree with that statement.
It hadn't been documented, but that doesn't mean it wasn't known.
Yeah. I think everyone knows, as we've just discussed, that teenagers can do some weird things.
Some silly things.
Some silly things. So the coroner also found the requirements dictated by the directorate, namely a risk assessment and school principal approval, were not complied with. So basically, they were required to have a risk assessment. There wasn't a risk assessment. So the policies and procedures weren't complied with.
Yeah, but the policies and procedures were also contradictory, so hard to comply with them.
Correct. So now we're going to look at whether the policies were, in fact, appropriate.
Yeah, right. Okay.
My guess is no.
So the coroner found that neither the Capture the Flag activity nor the environment at Mount Ainslie were unsuitable for the age group or the previous experience of the students who played that day, on the proviso that there was an appropriate risk assessment, supervision and structure. So everything was fine, basically, as long as there was adequate supervision and a risk assessment done.
How did they feel about adequate supervision?
We'll get into that.
Okay.
That said, the guidance material was inappropriate because there were differing requirements under each activity's relevant policy, and Capture the Flag could be classified as multiple different activities at once.
Yeah.
Without knowing how to define the game, the teachers were not able to define what requirements should have been followed.
Yep.
So it makes it a bit difficult. So following Adrian's death, the ACT Education Directorate commissioned an internal review of the management of all health and physical education activities in ACT public schools, including all relevant policies, procedures and guidelines. A task force
Excellent.
was then put in place to implement the findings from the review. And some of those changes implemented by the task force include requiring schools to define their boundaries and school site, which must exclude all areas separated from the school by a road.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so in this case, Mount Ainslie, not a school site, separated by a road. So they just made that very clear.
Yeah.
The directorate could then formally approve sites outside the boundaries for the purpose of excursions. So Mount Ainslie is now an approved school site.
Yeah.
The Campbell High School.
Yep.
But it's not part of the school.
Yep. Which we all kind of agreed on anyway, right?
Yeah. Schools are required to prepare risk assessments for particular activities with the assistance of example templates provided by the task force. And the multiple overlapping procedures that existed in the PE, sport and outdoor education space were replaced with 2 policies, one being a comprehensive and one being a simplified version. Cool. So much easier. So under the new procedures, capture the flag is considered a common physical activity, and as such, when conducted within an approved... Yep. It's common physical, whatever the hell that is. It is, that's what it is.
Okay.
And as such, when conducted within an approved school site, it requires a dynamic risk assessment, but not a formal one. So basically, one risk assessment that overarches
everything.
So every time it's played, that one risk assessment
is still valid.
Yeah, which makes sense. You didn't,
So if it is conducted on an unapproved school site, then the procedures of an excursion policy, so a separate policy, then apply. So in this case, it's an approved school site, so it's all good. So the case of Campbell High School, under the new policy, they are required to seek approval from the principal and permission from the student's parent or caregiver once every 12 months to allow students to play capture the flag at Mount Ainslie.
Yeah, that seems fair.
Yeah. So
it's kind of what that consent implied, but then didn't actually
do. Yeah, correct. So let's get into the supervision. All teachers interviewed agreed that one teacher was required per class, and classes could be up to 32 students. So in this case, there were 5 classes, there were 5 teachers.
Yep.
That was sort of the requirement.
Yeah.
So the coroner accepted that the students were not unsupervised during the game, but found that the supervising strategy of using existing teachers without additional support was inadequate when the game was being played at Mount Ainslie. This is because of the nature of the site did not permit continuous observation of all students, as there were natural landmarks and blocked views.
Yep.
So the general supervision strategy of the teachers was for each of the 5 teachers to be located at a particular observation point to try and provide coverage and monitoring to the whole area. The teachers would then move around in the area of play near their observation point to kind of see as much as they possibly could. So the jail was not within sight of the supervising teachers due to the incline of the hill and the dense bushland. The terrain in general meant that it was not possible for teachers to have eyes on all students at all times. There was no constant supervision or monitoring of the bases or the jail areas. No teachers witnessed the incident. However, Educator 1 had seen Adrian and TC sitting on a rock in the jail area shortly before the incident and told them to get involved back in the game. So obviously they were just sitting there.
I mean, they got involved, just not back in the game.
It was noted that there was no evidence that the behaviour of the supervising teachers was inadequate or that the teachers were acting contrary to procedure. In light of this, the coroner found that the inadequate supervision of the students was a failing of Campbell High School and the ACT Directorate and not any of the individual teachers involved.
It sounds like there was actually a pretty comprehensive attempt at being able to supervise as much as they possibly could with all those restrictions in place in terms of the natural land. Yeah. But I guess for me, like immediately I was like, hang on, but they couldn't see the jail or the base, which were possibly where the majority of the students might be hovering. If you think about the way that you play the game, it's either going to be a bunch of people in the jail or a bunch of people protecting the base.
Yes.
And so that to me seems an oversight in terms of like, I would have thought they would have wanted primary eyes on those 2 locations.
The highest density of
students would be.
Yeah. And then also you would think would be the place where there would be the highest proportional chance of incidents happening because that's where people are coming into contact with each
that
other.
kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And even though it's no contact, there's still a risk.
There's contact, yeah. So did the teachers have appropriate training? So it was suggested that the Directorate provided limited training in the access, interpretation and application of the relevant policies. Regardless of where Capture the Flag was played, the teachers were generally unaware of the contents of the relevant policies. So that's not great.
Yeah, but how many of those things do you read?
Yeah.
I don't feel like that's their fault specifically. Especially if there were 4 contradictory ones, right? Like,
I think there was more than 4.
Yeah, that's what I mean. If there was like a number of them, yeah, simplifying seemed good.
I think that was a good move. So evidence given by the educators also showed that the lack of awareness of relevant policies was not unique to Campbell High School, but is a historic and systemic issue across the public outdoor education sector in the ACT, which is an issue. The knowledge deficiency appeared to be mainly among educators who had been in the system for a long time rather than new graduates, which, again,
that's also fair.
Makes sense. So for this reason, the coroner recommended that separate cohorts of teachers be prioritised for professional development in respect of risk assessment more generally, as well as relevant policies and procedures.
Yeah.
Which, again, all seems fair. So finally, we'll just touch on whether there was a matter of public safety arising out of this incident. So in this part of the report, the coroner looked at reported deaths of children under the age of 18 under educational supervision in Australia. So between 2001 and 2021, there have been at least 25 such deaths. And in most of these deaths, issues surrounding supervision were related to or contributory to the death of the student.
Yeah, wow. That's more than I was expecting.
Yeah. So the coroner then went through a number of previous Australian inquests relevant to these issues. I won't go through them, but they were relevant to the coroner's finding that there has been an extensive history of failures of training policies and procedures, and that the inadequate processes and procedures at Campbell High School and the ACT Education Directorate constitute a matter of public safety issues.
Yeah.
Because obviously they're looking after public schools and there's been a number of deaths.
Yeah, and so they need to reduce those numbers.
Exactly. So in his final comments, the coroner expressed that with greater supervision, Adrian's death was preventable.
Yeah, potentially.
I think
I
think it was.
If a teacher had seen
them doing
the lifting up at the start, they would have been like, hey, just stop that.
It. Yeah. So I think it's the number of times they did it. If it happened on first go, then no. But the fact that they lifted it several times, I think I agree with that.
Yeah. So basically the coroner said that within the field of play, the schoolboys became mischievous, they misbehaved, they made multiple attempts to lift the log, which would have been going on for a number of minutes.
Yeah.
Adequate supervision should have swiftly resolved this behaviour and ensured a different outcome.
Yeah.
The coroner restated that this finding was not intended as a criticism of the individual teachers, but was a result of the deficient risk assessment processes that were in place that did not produce an outcome that had sufficient staff on the ground to ensure that appropriate supervision was in place.
Yeah.
So the coroner made the following recommendations. As said previously, certain cohorts of teachers be prioritised for professional development regarding risk assessments and policies, that the ACT Directorate takes steps to evaluate the success of the task force recommendation, and that the Attorney General review the operation and application of work health and safety law to the ACT Directorate to ensure that children and staff are kept safe. So pretty standard.
Yeah.
Which I don't think you can have any sort of real specific recommendations in this. You know, brief students that they shouldn't lift logs. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And again, the teacher attempted to say, don't muck around with the environment.
Yeah, don't pick things off the floor.
Yeah.
They went more specifically into like, don't throw sticks and rocks at each other.
Yeah.
You can imagine what the teachers were like. They'd be like, be sensible.
Everybody.
Don't be an idiot.
Exactly. So separately, Adrian's family also made recommendations, which the coroner included at the end of the report. I will read them out. They don't make a whole lot of sense to me because there wasn't really any context to them.
Okay.
The recommendations were that the Directorate review its policies on physical education activities and excursions with a view to compliance with the Safe Work Australia Code of Practice, and to report to the Attorney General about whether the policies comply with the model code that has been adopted by the ACT government. Don't really know what any of that means.
It sounds kind of basically like similar to what the coroner has recommended, though, that someone reviews that the updates and policies are actually making an improvement.
But with different bodies and entities, that the Directorate develop policies that foster ongoing work, health and safety training and report to the Minister on the development of those policies within 12 months.
Yeah.
And that the Directorate develop policies that foster ongoing work, health and safety compliance, responsibility and auditing within the Directorate and report to the Minister on the development of those policies within 12 months.
So just making sure that what updates have been made are having a positive effect.
Exactly.
And reporting.
And then
to various
reporting
people.
back on those within the year. So the ACT government received advance notice of those recommendations by the family, and the government didn't object to them, so the coroner endorsed the recommendations in the report and included them as recommendations, which I had not seen before.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So, yes, that is the coroner's report into the death of Christian Adrian Root, which it's a difficult one to sort of have much commentary around, I think, because it's not one of those reports where, you know, just wrong place and wrong time, or a number of things had to have happened for the death to occur. It was very much the fault of the individual.
Who was a minor.
Yeah,
And-
of course.
Yeah, didn't understand the consequences.
And the foreseeability of it was questionable in the sense that it's a risky landscape environment, supervision, etc., but the direct actual actions that occurred
It were
were not high on my list of things.
No.
Yeah, you would have think tripping, spraining an ankle, snakes,
Snake
spiders,
bite, etc.
tree falling, like a limb falling,
Yeah.
kids going to tag each other and accidentally pushing each other over.
Yeah, I would have expected other things that...
Yeah. To be more of a probable cause of issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But as the coroner said, and as the educators and teachers, and I think as everyone agree, it's not out of the realm of possibility for children who are, particularly in groups, who are unsupervised to misbehave.
Yes.
And who were bored. Because they were in the jail. Like, they were not doing
They were
anything.
waiting for someone to rescue them, which they probably knew no one was going
This
to.
could have, not quite equally, but potentially have happened when they were not at school.
Yes.
You know?
Very
So I
much so.
think it's also that time and place that it happened to occur while they're in school hours, not quite on school property.
That's absolutely correct.
But who's to say that they didn't do it on the weekend? Yeah.
Yeah, and if that were the case, then there wouldn't be a coroner's inquest because there wouldn't have been all these policy and procedure issues in place.
Yeah.
No one does a risk assessment for their personal life.
No. Oh, I mean, people do.
We kind of do it in our brain.
Well, yes,
Surely.
but you don't document that. I am going to the shops.
My
I
journal
might
is
get
very
into
interesting.
a car accident.
Yeah, exactly. So thanks everyone for joining us for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you back next time.
Bye.
Goodbye.